The world has seen countless warriors, conquerors, and revolutionaries, but few have wielded power without a sword, changed history without bloodshed, and inspired millions with nothing but truth and resilience. Mahatma Gandhi was one such man. Born into an ordinary family in India, no one could have predicted that this frail, soft-spoken lawyer would one day shake the very foundations of the British Empire. He did not march into battle with armies. Instead, he walked barefoot through dusty roads, carrying only an unshakable belief in justice. He did not strike his enemies. He simply refused to bow, forcing them to question their own morality. But behind the image of a saintly leader was a man who faced unimaginable struggles: betrayal, imprisonment, humiliation, and even rejection from his own people. What gave him the strength to keep going? What transformed him from a timid young boy into the father of a nation? The answers lie in his journey, one that began in the quiet corners of his childhood home and ended in a tragic moment that shook the world. To truly understand how Gandhi changed the world forever, we must step into his past, walk beside him through his greatest trials, and witness the moment he became an unstoppable force for freedom. But before he became a legend, he was just a boy who was afraid, a boy who would soon be forced to choose between fear and destiny. On October 2nd, 1869, in the coastal town of Porbandar, India, a frail child was born into a family of modest prestige. His name was Mohandas Karamchand Gandhi. No grand celebrations marked his arrival, no prophecies foretold his destiny. Yet this child, born to a devoted mother and a respected but unassuming father, would grow to challenge the most powerful empire on earth. Gandhi's father, Karamchand Gandhi, was a chief minister in the princely state of Porbandar, known for his integrity and strict moral values. His mother, Putlibai, was a deeply religious woman, fasting for days and immersing herself in prayers and acts of charity. It was from her that young Mohandas learned the power of self-discipline, the importance of truth, and the belief that non-violence was not weakness but strength in its purest form. Yet Gandhi was not born a saint. As a child, he was painfully shy, often avoiding strangers and retreating into silence. He was an average student, unremarkable in most ways, except for one thing: his conscience. He once stole from his brother to buy cigarettes, only to be so overwhelmed by guilt that he confessed everything to his father, expecting punishment. Instead, his father wept. That moment burned itself into Gandhi's heart. Truth, he realized, was not just an idea. It was a force powerful enough to shake a man to his core. At the age of 18, Gandhi did something unthinkable for a boy of his upbringing. He left India for England to study law. The journey was met with resistance from his conservative caste, who believed crossing the seas was a betrayal of tradition. Yet Gandhi was determined. He promised his mother he would stay away from meat, alcohol, and impure influences. In London, he was a stranger in an unfamiliar world. Desperate to fit in, he adopted English manners, wore Western suits, and even took violin and dancing lessons. But none of it felt right. Eventually he found solace in books, particularly the Bhagavad Gita, which would later become his spiritual guide. By the time he completed his studies, he was no longer just a law student. He was a man with a sharpened sense of identity, a growing belief in self-discipline, and an emerging realization that true power did not come from appearances, but from conviction. Returning to India, Gandhi struggled to establish himself as a lawyer. He was too timid to argue cases forcefully and failed to make an impact in the courtroom. Just when it seemed like his career was crumbling, an opportunity arrived from a distant land, a one-year contract to assist in a lawsuit in South Africa. Eager for a fresh start, he boarded a ship, unaware that he was about to step into the defining chapter of his life. In South Africa, Gandhi experienced humiliation like never before. He was thrown off a train in Pietermaritzburg for refusing to move from a first-class seat reserved for white passengers. He was kicked off sidewalks, denied entry into hotels, and treated as an inferior in a foreign land. Rage and humiliation burned within him. He had a choice: to accept oppression or to resist it. That night, as he sat shivering in the cold train station, something changed within him. He vowed never to bow to injustice again. The timid young man who had once hesitated to speak in court had found his voice, and soon the world would hear it. This was the birth of Satyagraha, the force of truth, and Gandhi's war had just begun. At first, Gandhi didn't rush into politics. He traveled across India, observing the lives of ordinary people, the farmers crushed under British taxes, the workers toiling under brutal conditions, the villages stripped of dignity. He realized that true independence wasn't just about driving out the British, it was about empowering the people to stand up for themselves. By 1919, he had seen enough. When the British passed the Rowlatt Act, allowing them to imprison Indians without trial, Gandhi called for mass protests. But the British responded with the Jallianwala Bagh massacre, where hundreds of peaceful protesters were gunned down. It was a turning point. The illusion of fairness was gone. The British would not leave willingly. And so Gandhi launched his first great act of defiance. After his release, Gandhi knew that freedom wouldn't come from anger. It had to come from symbolic defiance. He found his weapon in something so simple yet so essential: salt. At the time, the British controlled the salt trade, imposing heavy taxes on a necessity that belonged to the people. Gandhi decided to defy them in the most public way possible. In March 1930, at the age of 60, he began a 240-mile march to the Arabian Sea, walking from his ashram with 78 followers. Every step was a challenge to the empire. Every mile, more people joined him. By the time he reached the coast, thousands stood beside him. There, before the eyes of the world, he bent down, picked up a handful of salt, and let it slip through his fingers. It was a simple act, but it sent shockwaves through the British government. Across India, millions followed his lead, making their own salt, defying British rule. For the first time, the world saw an empire tremble before a barefoot man and his people. By the 1940s, World War II was raging, and Britain was growing weaker. Gandhi knew the time had come for the final demand: British rule must end immediately. In August 1942, he launched the Quit India movement, calling for total non-violent resistance until independence was granted. His words were clear: "We shall either free India or die in the attempt. We shall not live to see the perpetuation of our slavery." The British responded with brutal force: mass arrests, shootings and crackdowns. Gandhi was imprisoned once again, this time for nearly 2 years. His health deteriorated. His wife Kasturba died in prison, but his spirit never broke. Across the country, the movement raged on. The British, exhausted from war and unable to contain India's resistance, saw the writing on the wall. By 1947, they finally agreed to leave. On August 15, 1947, India was free. But Gandhi did not celebrate. As the nation erupted in joy, he stood apart, mourning the violence that had erupted between Hindus and Muslims during partition. He had won the battle against the British, but could he heal the wounds of his own people? Gandhi was not just a leader, he was a thinker, a philosopher, and a man who believed that true change begins within. He didn't just fight for India's independence, he laid down a way of life, a set of principles that could transform society itself. His ideas were radical for his time, yet they remain just as relevant today. At the heart of Gandhi's philosophy was ahimsa, the principle of non-violence. To him, violence was not just an act, it was a mindset, a poison that corrupted the soul and blinded people to truth. He believed that hatred could never be defeated with more hatred. It could only be conquered with love, patience, and the unwavering force of truth. For Gandhi, non-violence was not passivity, it was active resistance. It meant standing firm against injustice, refusing to comply with evil, and breaking oppression through moral strength, not physical force. This idea was revolutionary. In a world where power was defined by armies and weapons, Gandhi proved that courage, sacrifice, and the willingness to suffer for the truth were stronger than any bullet. His method of peaceful resistance inspired civil rights leaders like Martin Luther King Jr., Nelson Mandela, and countless others fighting for justice. Gandhi believed that true freedom was not just political, it was economic, social, and spiritual. He rejected materialism and embraced a life of simplicity, self-reliance, and humility. He wore a simple cotton dhoti instead of expensive clothes because he wanted to live like the poorest in India. He spun his own cloth with the charkha, encouraging others to do the same. To him, self-reliance was power. If India wanted to be free, it had to stop depending on British goods and industries. He promoted Swadeshi, urging Indians to support their own artisans and farmers rather than enriching their oppressors. But his simplicity was not just about economics, it was a way of life. He believed that the pursuit of wealth and luxury distracted people from truth, justice, and moral duty. In today's world of consumerism and excess, his message still holds deep meaning. For Gandhi, truth was more than honesty. It was a force that shaped everything. His entire philosophy of Satyagraha, or truth force, was built on the idea that truth has an undeniable power, one that can dismantle even the greatest empires. He refused to lie, deceive, or manipulate, even when it would have benefited him politically. His fights against the British were always grounded in moral authority. His belief was simple: if your cause is just, you do not need violence or deceit. Truth will win in the end. India was a land of many faiths. Hindus, Muslims, Sikhs, Christians and others had lived together for centuries. But British rule had deepened religious divisions, and as independence neared, violence between Hindus and Muslims exploded. Gandhi refused to accept religious hatred. He believed that all religions were different paths to the same truth, and that unity was essential for a free India. He fasted, travelled, and pleaded for peace when riots broke out. Even when partition divided India and Pakistan, he stood firm, trying to heal the wounds of a nation that was tearing itself apart. His commitment to unity cost him his life. On January 30th, 1948, he was assassinated by a Hindu extremist who believed he was too sympathetic to Muslims. But even in death, his message lived on. Hatred is weak, love is strong, and truth will always prevail. Gandhi's life was more than a fight for India's independence. It was a revolution in thought, a blueprint for how the oppressed could challenge injustice without violence. His methods and philosophy didn't just shake the British Empire, they echoed across continents, inspiring leaders, movements, and entire nations. Even after his death, his spirit continued to march on. Across America, Africa, and beyond, Gandhi's greatest legacy was proving that one person's conviction could ignite a movement, and that non-violence was not weakness, it was the ultimate strength. Gandhi's methods became the ultimate guide for oppressed people across the world. His influence stretched far beyond India, shaping movements against colonial rule, racial injustice, and authoritarian regimes. The Polish Solidarity movement in the 1980s used strikes and peaceful protests to challenge Soviet control. The Burmese pro-democracy movement, led by Aung San Suu Kyi, relied on Gandhi's principles to resist military rule. The Arab Spring in the 2010s saw young revolutionaries adopting non-violent protests to overthrow dictators. His impact was simple yet powerful. Violence may win battles, but truth and justice win wars. Gandhi had faced prison, beatings, and hunger strikes. He had been vilified by the British, betrayed by politicians, and misunderstood by many. But nothing could have prepared the world for what happened on January 30th, 1948. The day the Mahatma fell, just months after India gained independence, Gandhi's worst fear had come true. Religious violence between Hindus and Muslims had erupted, tearing the country apart. He had spent his final days traveling, fasting, and pleading for unity, trying to heal the wounds of partition. But not everyone saw him as a hero. To extremists, Gandhi's compassion toward Muslims made him a traitor to Hindu nationalism. And on that fateful evening, as he walked to a prayer meeting in New Delhi, Nathuram Godse, a radical Hindu nationalist, stepped forward, raised a gun, and fired 3 shots into his chest. As Gandhi collapsed to the ground, his last words were whispered, "He Ram, O God." More than 70 years later, his message still lives. His principles of non-violence, truth, and unity remain a guide for those who seek justice. Every peaceful protest against oppression carries his imprint. Every leader who fights for equality without raising a weapon walks in his footsteps. Every movement that believes in moral strength over brute force echoes his voice. From civil rights activists to environmentalists, from world leaders to ordinary citizens, his philosophy continues to shape the course of history. Gandhi proved that one man's conviction could shake an empire. That change does not come through violence, but through truth, courage, and love. He was not a perfect man. He had flaws, made mistakes, and faced criticism. But what made him extraordinary was his unwavering belief in humanity's ability to rise above hatred. The world remembers him not just as a leader, but as a force of nature, one that still whispers to those who dare to dream of a better world. And so, in every act of non-violence, in every fight for justice, and in every call for peace, his spirit marches on. Because Mahatma Gandhi did not just change the world, he became a part of it forever.